It's a cold winter morning just before Christmas. The town lies under a thick blanket of frost, the air is crisp and biting. Outside the local hospital, a crowd of reporters and townsfolk gathers as the cameras flash relentlessly. A wealthy politician, flanked by news crews, hands an oversized check to a frail child enduring their second round of chemotherapy. His perfectly white, aligned teeth shine as he casually assures the crowd that such generosity will continue, provided he's re-elected in the upcoming election. A few blocks away in the dim glow of a small apartment, the local elementary school janitor watches the scene unfold in his TV. He too had donated to the same hospital, a modest $100 from his Christmas bonus. It would mean postponing the replacement of his worn-out boots, now riddled with holes, but it was a sacrifice he was happy to make. For as long as he could remember, helping others had brought him the greatest sense of purpose, and this quiet act of generosity filled him with a deep, resolute joy. 2 donations, 2 drastically different scenarios. But is one of these donations better than the other? Is one of them more moral? How do we measure the moral worth of an act? Questions like these lie at the heart of the human experience. Since the dawn of civilization, we've debated life's greatest mysteries, such as what's the meaning of life, what comes after death, and what separates right from wrong. In our search for answers, we've built frameworks, principles to guide our choices and define how we live. And thus, morality was born. But creating morality was just the beginning. The hard part is actually defining it. Over centuries, countless interpretations and definitions have emerged, each trying to uncover what it means to truly be moral. But to answer this question, we'll need to go back to quills and candlelight, an average life expectancy of 35, and to one of humanity's greatest intellectual leaps forward, back to the Age of Enlightenment. Among the countless philosophers, scientists, and artists of this era, many contributions were made to the field of ethics. But of these many contributions, 3 were so groundbreaking that their influence is still felt in Western society centuries later. The first of these men was David Hume. Born in 1711 in Edinburgh, Scotland, he entered the world at the height of the Age of Enlightenment, an era bursting with advancements in science, art, and culture. Across Europe, people began to challenge the authority of monarchies and the church, turning instead to reason, science, and individual inquiry. Empowered by the spirit of progress, they sought to understand the world through their own observation and rational thought. But the means in which people pursued this understanding varied, and soon the Enlightenment became marked by a philosophical clash between 2 schools of thought: the empiricism of the British Isles and the rationalism of continental Europe. Empiricists like Isaac Newton and John Locke argued that knowledge comes from sensory experience and evidence drawn from the real world. Locke famously argued that the mind begins as a tabula rasa, a blank slate shaped by experience, while Newton deduced the laws of motion by watching apples fall. Meanwhile, rationalists such as René Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz argued that true understanding could be uncovered through innate ideas and pure reason alone. They believed that our senses are inherently flawed and unreliable. After all, there are frequencies we can't hear and microscopic particles we can't see, so why rely on such limited tools to answer life's most profound questions? Hume was born just 4 years before Scotland's union with England, bringing him into close proximity of the empiricist tradition, a union that would profoundly influence his later philosophies. Hume grew up as the second son in a well-off family of distant nobility. Like many boys of noble lineage, his upbringing emphasized education as a cornerstone of success. He entered the University of Edinburgh at a remarkably young age, around 12, though some accounts suggest he may have started as early as 10. Initially, he followed the family tradition and studied law, like his father and older brother. However, his passion quickly shifted to philosophy and learning, leading him to leave formal education behind and pursue his studies independently. But despite his education and noble ancestry, Hume had no learned profession and no source of income by the age of 25. His father had died when he was just 2 years old, leaving behind a sizable patrimony, but as tradition dictated, the lion's share went to his eldest brother. This essentially left Hume broke. Needing a way to support himself, Hume turned to writing. He hoped to share his ideas and philosophies with the public in the form of books, and in doing so, earn a living and perhaps even gain recognition for his work. At the age of 27, Hume published his first major work, A Treatise of Human Nature. Ambitious and wide-ranging, the book represented years of thought and effort on a staggering array of subjects. But to Hume's dismay, it was received with a pretty lukewarm reception. He famously lamented that it fell dead-born from the press, meaning no one really gave a shit. Its dense style and complex ideas made it inaccessible to the average reader, and it failed to find an audience. Like, take a look at this line. Even in the 18th century, when someone is using the word betwixt and they're not writing a fairy tale, you know you're in for a long ride. Undeterred though, he reworked and refined his ideas into 2 more approachable books. These works condensed his ideas and incorporated relatable examples and analogies, making them easier for the general public to understand. While they didn't sell particularly well during his lifetime, they eventually solidified his legacy as one of Europe's greatest philosophers. See, in the past, most philosophers argued that morality was either divine by God or could be deduced by reasoning alone. Central to Hume's philosophy was his belief that morality is instead rooted in emotion. His argument centered around the idea that no action, regardless of how heinous it might seem, is inherently bad when analyzed purely through our senses. Instead, it's our emotional response that gives moral weight to our actions. To demonstrate this, imagine you're a mugger in 18th century London. You've cornered a drunken laborer on his way home from the pub and at knife point demand he hand over his valuables. But instead of complying, he fights back. In the scuffle, you stab him. In that exact moment, you're overwhelmed by sensations. The warmth of blood spilling onto your hands, the scent of trash in the narrow alley, the sound of ragged breathing. Yet none of these sensations are inherently bad or evil on their own. They just are what they are. According to Hume, it's only when we reflect on these actions with our emotions, our empathy, disgust, our regret, that we judge the act as morally wrong. But this idea also carries with it a profound implication. If morality stems from feelings, then morality itself is relative, shaped by the cultural and emotional context of the time and place. Consider, for example, eating beef. Extremely taboo and deeply immoral in many Indian cultures, but a standard part of Western diets. Similarly, culling the weak, not only accepted but celebrated as a moral duty in ancient Sparta, but barbaric by today's standards. This relativity challenges the idea of universal moral truths, suggesting instead that what we view as right or wrong evolves with the collective emotions and values of society. Hume's ideas gradually spread all across Europe, eventually reaching a young academic in Eastern Prussia. The impact on him was so great that it stirred him to develop his own moral philosophy, one that would shape ethical thought for centuries. That young man was Immanuel Kant. Born in 1724 in the Prussian town of Königsberg, Kant was the 4th of 9 children in a family of modest means. His father worked as a harness maker, earning enough to live comfortably but by no means lavishly. This humble lifestyle mirrored his parents' devotion to pietism, a form of Lutheranism that placed a strong emphasis on moral discipline and personal responsibility. These values also shaped Kant's early education, which was strict, punitive, and heavily disciplined. Like many religious upbringings of the time, his studies centered more on scripture and Latin than on the natural sciences. When he was 16, Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg, where he studied philosophy and the natural sciences. Being in Prussia, his education focused heavily on the works of German rationalists like Leibniz and Wolff. But thanks to his academic advisor, who followed developments in British philosophy, Kant was exposed to Newton and other British thinkers as well. Eventually, after many years, he was able to secure a job as an independent lecturer at the university. He taught a variety of subjects, from logic and metaphysics to ethics. It was during this period that he began to formulate his groundbreaking ideas on morality, culminating in the publication of one of his most seminal works, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, in 1785. This changed everything. Never before had anyone attempted to create a moral framework, a set of universal principles that every rational being could follow. Principles so grounded in reason that Kant believed no one, upon reflection, could deny them. But unlike Hume, Kant rejected the idea that morality was relative. Instead, he believed every action was inherently right or wrong. And from this belief, the categorical imperative was born. But to understand the categorical imperative, it helps to compare it to what Kant called hypothetical imperatives. These are conditional rules for achieving our specific desires. For example, if you want to stay healthy, you should exercise regularly. If you want to pass an exam, you should study. In contrast, categorical imperatives are unconditional and universally binding. They're moral commands that apply to all rational beings, regardless of personal goals or desires. Kant's categorical imperative can be understood through 3 key formulations. A common misconception is that each of these are unique rules, but it's better to think of them as different ways of expressing the same fundamental idea. For simplicity, let's just focus on 2 of them. The first is the formula of universality. Kant tells us to act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? If universalizing your action leads to a contradiction or a world you wouldn't want to live in, then the action is morally wrong. Take lying, for example. If everyone lied to get out of trouble, trust would break down and truth itself would lose all meaning. Lying, therefore, fails Kant's test because it can't be universally willed without contradiction. The second is the formula of humanity. Here Kant says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means to an end. This is Kant's way of essentially just saying, don't use people. Every rational being, according to Kant, has inherent worth and dignity. Treating someone as an end means respecting your autonomy, whether their ability to think, choose, or act for themselves. For instance, if you manipulate someone through deceit to get what you want, you reduce them to a tool for your own purposes, ignoring their ability to make informed choices. Both formulations highlight different aspects of Kant's moral philosophy, but they lead to the same conclusion. Acting morally means acting rationally, universally, and with respect for others. Another thing you might notice is that neither of these formulations really mention anything about outcomes. Instead, Kant places significant emphasis on intent. For him, morality is not about the consequences of an action, but about acting out of a sense of duty, guided by rational moral principles. This unwavering focus on duty and intent is why Kant is often referred to as the strict philosopher. For him, it's not enough to just create good outcomes. Those outcomes must result from a deliberate sense of moral responsibility. But this uncompromising stance on ethics leads to some pretty controversial conclusions. Take, for example, one of the most famous thought experiments coined by his critics, Kant's axe. Imagine you're sitting at home reading by the fireplace when your friend suddenly bursts in, terrified. Between ragged breaths, he exclaims that someone's trying to kill him. Moments later, there's a heavy knock at the door. You open it to find a suspicious-looking man holding an axe. Upon meeting his gaze, he asks if your friend is there. What should you do? Should you lie to protect him? According to the categorical imperative, lying is always wrong because it cannot be universalized. So Kant argues you should still tell the truth, come what may to your friend. His reasoning is this. If you lie and unknowingly cause harm, say your friend flees out the back and runs straight into the axe murderer, you would bear partial responsibility for that outcome. Your inherently immoral act, lying, indirectly caused your friend to be harmed. But by telling the truth, you adhere to the universal law that lying is wrong, and your moral integrity remains intact. Even if your friend were murdered, you would still be squeaky clean. Remember, it's not about the consequences, but about the principle. And this is where Kant's philosophy can feel deeply unsettling. How can it be moral to tell the truth even when doing so leads to harm? Shouldn't protecting others take precedence over rigid moral rules? It's this very conflict, the idea between doing what's right and doing what's good, that would shape the work of a certain 19th century English philosopher, a man who rejected Kant's strict focus on principles and instead turned morality outward towards real-world consequences of our actions. Where Kant asks us to act out of duty, he asks a simpler question: what makes the world better? John Stuart Mill was born in London in 1806, just a few years after Kant's death. His life was shaped by an extraordinary and grueling education. By the age of 3, he was learning Greek. By 8, he had mastered Latin, history, and advanced mathematics. By his teens, Mill's work was already being published in academic newspapers and journals. His father deliberately isolated him from other children to ensure that nothing would disrupt his studies. This relentless intellectual training turned Mill into a prodigy, but it also nearly destroyed him. Mill's father, James Mill, imposed this grueling education to mold his son into a genius that would advance the cause of utilitarianism. The core idea is simple. Action should bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. And as a close friend and follower of Jeremy Bentham, the philosophy's founder, James fully embraced these views and saw his son as the one to carry on the torch. But for John Stuart Mill, the life his father had meticulously laid out for him began to unravel. At the age of 20, Mill suffered a severe mental breakdown, overwhelmed by a life devoted entirely to study with no space for joy, creativity, or emotional fulfillment. Having spent his entire youth working towards the abstract goal of advancing a just society, Mill realized that achieving this aim wouldn't necessarily bring him happiness. He was left purposeless, contemplating whether life was even worth living in the first place. It was during this dark period that Mill discovered the poetry of William Wordsworth. You can't make this up, by the way. His last name is literally Wordsworth. He was pretty much destined to be a poet. And that he did. Wordsworth became one of the leading poets of the Romantic movement and was eventually appointed as the poet laureate of Victoria, England. His work was therapeutic for Mill. It's introspective and celebrates the human experience, the little moments of everyday life for everyday people, the beauty in the things that we take for granted. For the first time in his life, Mill learned to appreciate these simple, fleeting moments in life. He realized that life was not just about striving for grand, abstract goals like saving the world, but about finding meaning in the experience of living itself. This revelation was likely the greatest turning point in Mill's life. Not only did he continue to live with a renewed sense of purpose, but it also served as the catalyst for one of his greatest contributions to ethics. You see, Bentham's utilitarianism had argued that all pleasures were fundamentally equal. To him, the joy of falling in love and pursuing one's dreams were no different than doing heroin or eating an entire pint of Ben & Jerry's in one sitting. Morality, in his view, was essentially just the maximization of dopamine and serotonin. But Mill rejected this. Nature, human connection, self-actualization, these were the things that had inspired him to live and had given his life meaning again. These were the experiences that elevated the human spirit, that gave life its richness and meaning. Mill argued that pleasures tied to intellectual, moral, and emotional growth, what he called higher pleasures, were inherently better than our base, hedonistic indulgences. As he famously put it, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. With this insight, Mill redefined Bentham's utilitarianism by emphasizing the quality of happiness over its mere quantity. By distinguishing higher pleasures from our base desires, Mill elevated the pursuit of happiness to something deeper and more meaningful. But despite the changes Mill made to utilitarianism to make it more human, its core principle remained fundamentally opposed to Kant's philosophy. Where Kant's philosophy focused on intent and universal duty, Mill's utilitarianism looked outward, judging morality by outcomes and the practical good they produce. And then there's Hume, who doesn't believe in objective morality and instead just cares about the vibe. He just leaves it up to each individual culture to ask themselves if something feels right or wrong. So it seems like we still don't have any definitive answers. It seems like instead we have three wildly different perspectives on how to be our best selves. But maybe looking at each one through the same lens, so to speak, might help. Let's revisit our two donations from the beginning. On one hand, we have the janitor, who gives $100 out of genuine kindness. On the other, we have the politician, whose $100,000 donation could save countless lives, but whose intentions are questionable at best. Which action is more moral? For John Stuart Mill, both the janitor's and the politician's actions are moral, but the politician's $100,000 donation holds greater moral value, dubious intentions aside, simply because it produces the greatest good. That donation has the power to save lives, fund treatments, and help far more people than the janitor's $100 contribution. For Mill, outcome is king. Kant naturally believes the exact opposite. Since neither the politician nor the janitor acts purely out of a sense of duty, Kant would argue that neither action is truly moral. Even the janitor's act, while admirable, is driven by personal emotions and the satisfaction he gains from helping others, not by a commitment to a universal moral law. For Kant, morality lies not in what happens, but in why we act. Hume sits somewhere in the middle. To him, morality is rooted in human emotion, our natural compassion and sympathy. Hume would argue that the janitor's donation is entirely moral because it springs from genuine feelings of care and kindness. The politician's act, by contrast, motivated by self-interest or ulterior motives, is less moral, perhaps even immoral, because it lacks this emotional sincerity. In this sense, the answer really lies in what we value the most in ourselves. There probably won't ever be a single correct moral code. Just like the meaning of life, it's up to each of us to find our own answer. Personally, I think there's something incredible in all three of these ideas. I agree with Hume's moral relativity, that our idea of what's good and what's bad is vastly different today than from a millennium ago. In the future, some of our practices will probably not be looked upon very favorably, just as how human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire tends to not be super celebrated today. I also deeply admire Kant's devotion to duty and responsibility. Compassion is wonderful, but some people are just naturally born more empathetic than others. Just as we don't see those born richer as inherently better, why should we view the emotionally gifted as morally superior? We love and relate to flawed characters that overcome their natural weaknesses and insecurities to be a better human being, and no philosophy reflects that better than Kant's. And finally, I think Mill's utilitarianism, valuing the many over the few, is the best foundation for building societies. Most modern civilizations have attempted to implement this through various systems like democracy, social welfare programs, and universal education. In this regard, Mill's ideas have had the greatest impact on the systems we rely upon today. But where do you stand? Which of these ideas resonates with you the most? Are there any that you really disagree with? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because there's honestly so many different ways to interpret these ideas. Thanks for watching, and if you want to keep seeing content like this, then you should totally subscribe. And until next time, have a great day.